Okay, so we're going to get started again. So welcome back. Welcome. This presentation is malware analysis. It was initially listed as ain't nobody not got time for that, but I think don't is catchier. So I think if I get this again, this is going to go next time. Ain't nobody don't got time for that. So just to reintroduce myself, for anyone who's not here at 10 a.m. from assembly, my name is Tansey. I'm currently out of Atlanta-ish, and was in Boston and New York before that. I do some malware analysis stuff. I guess that makes more sense here during the malware analysis talk. And I was doing some incident response stuff before. So you can contact me via email, Twitter, Freenode. Just note that is a 0 in Zoinks. The guy who had Zoinks without 0 wanted like 10 grand for it. And malware analysis isn't like that lucrative. Start writing malware. So cool. All right, so this actually happened with very, very convenient timing. A couple of days ago in downtown Atlanta was the Georgia Tech Cybersecurity Summit. And it was a really cool event. They had a couple of projects from students or employees of GTRI, the Georgia Tech Research Institute, presenting their projects with posters. It was really cool. I almost said Bud. I don't mean Bud. At first, there was a keynote talk Dave Attell gave, and it was also really good. But there was this quote in there that kind of struck me, got me curious, and I decided it was kind of ideal to open up a malware analysis presentation with. So the quote from his deck, and he said it a little bit differently verbally, but it kind of got the same thing across. The answer is not better malware analysis. The answer is to never do malware analysis. So as a result, the presentation is canceled. He put this quote out there, and it got me a little curious, because obviously I'm a little biased. It's like a thing I do. So for some context, right before he said this, he said something about anomaly-based self-death, and that you should instantly rebuild at any sign of trouble. So given the sequence of statements, I think maybe this was hyperbole. I don't know. I've emailed him to ask. I haven't heard back, so for now I'm just rolling with it with that context. But I disagree strongly with the fact that you should never do malware analysis. And hopefully you will too in the next 40-ish minutes. So another quote from his presentation, and this was mostly copied out of his deck. I added some context here to put it in context where he was talking about it. A problem with some threat intelligence feeds is that your company gets the same anomaly model as every other company. So just like full disclosure, I work for a company that has one of these, so just you should know that when I talk about it. But I thought these two statements that he gave were kind of directly contradictory. And I thought that because the reason that he took issue with threat feeds was because he said they're not specific to your environment. You're not getting context. Every company's getting the same data. And I wondered how you can make this statement and then follow it up with this statement, that you should never do malware analysis. And the reason I was kind of curious, is this. So typically when people think of malware, the first thing that comes to mind is data that's going out, right? Things that are being exfiltrated. And that's a very fair first thought, and I might even say it's a very fair second thought. But something that you should also realize is that malware, when it does anything, leaves behind some information of its own. And being able to kind of recognize that information and use it for yourself can be very beneficial. So this is, of course, as stated by the ... it's not an inclusive list of everything you can find in malware. A couple of examples of recoverable things. Command and control hosts. So if you're just like a personal researcher at home, I take that back. This can be valuable for basically anybody. If you're working in a SOC or an incident response team, this can be a way to find other hosts on your network that were compromised. If you're a researcher at home, it gives you parts of a malware host infrastructure to potentially scope out if that's what you want to do. You can find things like encryption keys. Maybe it can expose to you data that wasn't exposed before. Maybe config files are on your disk, but they're encrypted and you want to know what they say. Maybe there was some encrypted traffic that went over the wire and you'd like to know what was in there. A lot of times this takes the form of just like XOR keys that you can pull out of a piece of malware. Or sometimes you can even reverse the encryption that people implemented themselves because they didn't do it right. Or the key is there, whatever. You can find implementation flaws. So if anyone in here is a developer or has ever written code, which I wager is probably a thing that has happened, you recognize that it doesn't always work the way you might expect it to. Maybe there are things like bugs. Malware is just code. Malware has bugs too. An example, not that having malware with a bug is so rare as to need a particular example, but one that people might have heard of is this malware called CryptoDefense. So it was a ransomware, lookalike CryptoLocker kind of malware that came out months ago. And it looked sound until someone found out that they totally messed up the key size. And they made the keys way too small, so that someone who wanted to could actually attack the keys that encrypted their stuff to recover them. An implementation flaw that someone found by reversing it. Sometimes you might find things like exploits in malware. Excuse me. Or most importantly for me is malware capabilities. It's like the phrase that I use for this is if you want to know what's in a book, like the phrase is don't judge a book by its cover, right? You read it. Malware is the same way. If you'd like to know what it's really doing or really capable of doing, open it up and find out. So again, there's more here. These are just some examples of things that you'll find regularly. Exploits maybe less regularly. But the rest of these things you can find really kind of regularly. So to go back to Dave's quote, the reason I disagree, nothing can be more specific to the threats in your own environment, whether it's your home, but this is really based more towards like enterprises or companies or whatever. But nothing can be more specific to your environment than indicators that you've pulled out of things that you found in it. So if you're kind of rebuking threat feeds because they're not like contextually relevant, you'd want to get this info out of malware because that's as relevant as anything can be. So to pull this malware out, or to pull this information out of malware, we do these things that we call malware analysis, which just so happens to be the topic of today's talk. Cool. So I have a few goals for today, for this presentation specifically. The first, these goals might sound like the same as the goal for the assembly presentation, is to demonstrate, I guess, the value of analyzing malware, why it's worth doing, whether you work somewhere that is related to this, or you're just at home. It can be a fun project too. But then also to suggest a few things that are worth doing, regardless of your skill level and the amount of time you have to devote to a thing. I think you can pull information out with just about any set of circumstances. I'll try and show you some ways to do that, depending on where you are as someone who wants to analyze malware. So in order to talk a bit about this, I'm going to break it up into a couple of categories. The first is static analysis and dynamic analysis. And I guess I should stop here. Thanks. Malware analysis is text heavy, and as such, the presentation will be later as well, because there will be screenshots of logs. I will try to narrate them, and there will be subtitles. But if you're interested in looking at the logs, you're probably not going to be able to move back there. I won't judge you for not moving. I didn't move yesterday when Alaka said to, but just know, there will be small stuff. So, okay, so we're breaking it up into static analysis and dynamic analysis. Static analysis is analyzing malware without running it. And there's lots of things that can be. Dynamic analysis is the opposite. It's running malware to find things out about it. And we will discuss both of them, but it's important to break them up a bit. Oh, another important note is that this is not like a Gartner Magic Quadrant situation, right? The top right is not like best, where bottom left is the worst. I'm not like a Gartner person, but I think that's like how it's at least interpreted. I don't know. But it is not like that here. Any one of these might be the best for you. And I'll also break it up one more time. I'll talk about more advanced things and more basic things. You can also maybe substitute this with quick and not quick, but there is sometimes kind of like a skill level associated with them as things to be mindful of. The thing is that spending more time to find out more information might not be useful for you, or it might be useful for you depending on the context that you're in. So this practice gets to go through a formal peer review, but I feel pretty good about it. And the point of it is to show that you can get valuable information very quickly, as evidenced by this part of the graph. But the thing is that you'll get a lot quickly, and then you'll slow down a little bit. And then it'll slow down a little bit more, and then eventually I think it jumps up again. And that's where peer review might debate this graph. But basically the point is to show that you don't have to beat the game to get useful information. You can get useful information pretty much right off the bat. Glad I put that in. The important thing to consider is what information would help you personally. So for that, you have to think about the circumstances that you're in, right? Maybe you're like a malware analyst or hobbyist who wants to effectively dox a piece of malware, write a report on everything that it does. Totally cool, right? Awesome. Maybe you're not though. Maybe you're working in a SOC and you have other tickets waiting and you'd like to just find a couple IPs to block or look for in your network. Maybe you manage an endpoint solution and you want endpoint indicators to look for. Or maybe you're an incident response and you saw some encrypted traffic go across the wire and you want to figure out what was in that traffic. All of these things kind of require different information, but most of them don't require complete line-by-line disassembly to get useful things out, and that's what I'd like to show. So I have to apologize for this slide and say, sorry, I swear it's relevant. The goal is not to sell anything because I can't. The goal is to give you the context for which I have to look at malware from at work. Because the whole point of the presentation is context in malware analysis. So I work for a vendor that sells network visibility products. That's like the 10-second summary. So when I'm looking at a piece of malware, I need to look for things that I can find traveling over a network. Things like registry keys are useful for me to learn about how malware operates, but it's not like things that I can look for and call it a day. Maybe it is for you. If you work as a vendor, think about your products. If you work as like a security team at an enterprise, think about the types of visibility you have through whatever means. The whole point of this presentation is to ensure that you think about what type of information it is you want, so you don't try to discover everything if you don't have the time to do that. So again, network-based information is the lens which I look at malware from when I'm doing it for work. So again, I just had to get that out there to put some context behind the presentation. So the obvious disclaimer, and then the wait, that was stupid part. Don't try this at home. Wait, do try it at home, do try it at work. Just do it in a prepared environment. Because when you're playing with malware, even if you're doing static analysis stuff, when you're playing with malware, you're increasing your risk of doing something accidentally stupid a lot. Yeah, so you want to do it. I'm advocating you doing it. I don't know if that's a dangerous thing to say. But again, I'm just kind of advocating you do it in a prepared environment. So I'm not going to talk too much about what that environment should look like. We can discuss it afterwards. It's just for sake of time. Basically, it should be a VM, and unless you're prepared your network, you should turn the network adapter off. And there's more, but that's what we're going to say for now. The important secondary disclaimer is, yes, even the static stuff should be done in a prepared environment. So this was a headline from like less than a week ago, I think. The headline was vulnerability in widely used strings utility could spell trouble for malware analysts. And I'm just going to read the first line to you. One of the first things a malware analyst does when encountering a suspicious executable file is to extract the text strings found inside it, because they can provide immediate clues about its purpose. This is true, and it's also the first thing that I will show you doing. But the point here is that even that can get you owned. Things that you don't think can get you owned, things that you don't think will cause any trouble, can cause trouble. You're moving a file, you're going to accidentally click it, it'll happen to everybody. Just do it in a safe place. Okay, so ignoring that whole strings article for a moment, because it'll come right back. The first thing that we're going to do is talk about some basic static analysis things that you can do with malware. What I liken it to is like trying to figure out what's in a present before you're allowed to open it, like the night before your birthday or Christmas or whatever. Someone gives you a box that says, you're going to like this, and they're going to tell you what. Maybe you don't smell presents, but like maybe you shake it or you pick it up, see how heavy it is, you see if it makes any kind of noise or the parts that are rattling. You try and find all this information out about it to kind of give you an idea of what's inside without actually opening it. And that's kind of what this basic static analysis is. It's trying to observe meta information, and that's in quotes because, frankly, it's not a very good term. I need to find a better thing. But observe certain information about the malware while having to run it or do any kind of deep parsing. Things that you can do very, very quickly. And that's what we're going to do. So remember that whole strings is the first thing a malware analyst does. This is strings, and it's the first thing I did. So a few weeks back there was a bug. Maybe some of you guys heard about it. ShellShocked was a thing. I said that. I had to rephrase that joke because I gave it like another presentation recently, and people thought I didn't know what ShellShocked was. And it was kind of a weird moment. So I do know what ShellShocked is, just to make it clear, and I assume most of you do too. Just as a bit of a quick rundown, in case you're not like super familiar with it, it was a remote code execution bug that manifested itself in Bash, but you can find it all over the internet in a remotely accessible fashion, and it's kind of a mess. So I'm not going to talk more about it, about the bug itself. But due to the nature of the bug, how common it was, and how easy it was to exploit, one of the major concerns, or excitements that we had about it, was that a worm was going to come about. Because it was a bug that was appeared to be potentially wormable. A worm is malware that spreads itself that way. So we were concerned that we were going to see this. We were concerned about it. So the morning after, the night after the disclosure, we started seeing a lot of malware being spread via ShellShocked exploitation. So naturally, the first reaction was like, is this the one? Is this the one? Is this the one? So we kept pulling down samples to see, like, is this worming itself, or is this just people getting owned via ShellShocked and then downloading malware? So we have to try and triage some of this stuff quickly. This is actually an example of some of the malware that was being distributed by ShellShocked that very first night, the very first morning. So the first thing I did, just like that news article said, was run strings in a prepared environment. And we found a bunch of things. Working from the bottom up, we found common passwords and usernames. Like, I don't know if you can see it, it was root, admin, user, login, guest, tor, password. There were a bunch of things like that. We found an IP address, 162 something, that we suspected, and it was true that it used for command and control. We found a bunch of messages here that I'll read some to you. Junk flooding, that's a format string. This person for this many seconds. UDP flooding, this person for this many seconds. TCP flooding, this person for this many seconds. Hold flooding, I don't even know what that is. I should look at that. Anyone know what protocol hold is? Okay, there's a note. Flooding people for X amount of seconds. So it became pretty evident, and this was like real life, straight out of the box. It told us all of these things. And we also saw what I didn't know off the bat, but I Googled and found was apparently some kind of busybox shellcode. So we were able to kind of tell what the goal of this malware was. Now this doesn't paint us the complete picture, but this was done in under a minute. As you can see here, there were about 2,000 strings found, but a lot of it is immediately recognizable as visible garbage. So when you scroll through, eventually you'll see things that look like text. So yeah, all of these things came out for us in under a minute. Now this is IP addresses and like the purpose of what this bot is. It gave a really good picture for the amount of time invested. Again, here's at the beginning of the graph. Also, this is a tool IDA. You can see this in plenty of other places. It's not specific to IDA. It's just the tool that I use, and I'll talk about alternatives in a little bit. But something else that you can sometimes see statically are things like imported function calls in like a Windows binary, for example. And it is admittedly kind of a high-level view, but it can show you some of the functionality of malware. So like here in this particular piece, we saw a bunch of imported symbols from the WinHTTP like set of functions. And we saw some like other libraries that didn't tell us specifically what the malware was going to do, but it gave us a bit of a hint towards capabilities. So again, this is not like the end-all be-all of malware analysis, but it's something that we can see pretty quickly. That said, one of the bummers of basic static analysis is that packing can kind of eat your lunch. So packing is something we see a lot in malware. You might have heard of it as packing or crypting. It's effectively trying to obfuscate the contents of a binary. And it will do this to A, like avoid detection by detection products, and B, try and frustrate analysts who are working with it. So what it'll do is oftentimes, in very technical terms, scramble the contents of a binary and just leave what's called an unpacking stub. So when the malware goes to execute itself, it can actually unpack itself and run in memory. But if you're just looking at the binary, you're just going to see garbage. So again, a lot of times packed malware will look like garbage in these things. So yeah, that's a bit of a bummer, but again, it's like what they call it, the low-hanging fruit of malware analysis. You can get good stuff there. So on the bright side, though, if you have packed malware, no matter how hardcore the packing is, if it can't execute, it's not a problem, right? So we kind of just say, okay, you can execute now. Just let the malware do what it wants to do. And that's where basic dynamic analysis comes in. It's executing malware and observing what it actually does. So again, there's potentially a thin line between getting owned and doing dynamic malware analysis. If you just, this slide covered it, I guess. A prepared environment is important for static analysis, but even more so for dynamic analysis. And I say there's a thin line between getting owned and doing dynamic analysis, because what you're doing is you're owning yourself. The difference in that is that A, you're prepared, and B, you're trying to make some kind of use out of it. So the reason it's so much more important to prepare your environment, in dynamic analysis, well, there's two. For one, in static analysis, there's a chance you might accidentally execute your malware. In dynamic analysis, you're executing your malware. Like it's going to happen. It's a thing. It's the thing. So you have to make sure that that box has nothing on it that shouldn't be exfiltrated. Assume everything is. That box should not be one that you then go browse the web on afterwards. That should be specifically for that. It should be revertible. You have to make considerations. Should my malware be able to reach the internet? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes no. Should it be able to access other legitimate hosts on my network? Most of the time the answer is no. But just things you have to consider, even more so when you're doing dynamic analysis. On the other hand, your eyes make really poor kind of observation sensors for malware. And this is where I say the line is very thin. Because if I make a VM, it's in the right environment, and it's segmented off on the network, and it can only get to part of the internet that I want it to get to, and I run it, and doesn't let it do its thing, I haven't learned anything. I've just infected myself with malware. So the goal is to take information out of it. So you want to set up your environment so you can monitor things that are important to you, like maybe file system changes, registry modifications, network traffic. You have to be set up to capture things. And I'll show you two tools that I'll use in this next analysis to capture tons of information. all free tools except for IDA. It's not free. Very not free. So the sample you're about to see are logs from a CryptoLocker infection. So CryptoLocker is actually, as far as I'm aware at this point, defunct. The infrastructure was taken down during this thing called Operation Var. It was a really cool thing, but the malware, as far as I know right now, should not be active. That said, I think it's a really good example to use here because A, it analyzes quite nicely for 20 minutes, 22 minutes, we should get rolling. But B, because people know what CryptoLocker does, basically. So it's kind of cool to see where that information that you may have read actually comes from. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So this is the text part that I was talking about. You don't have to read line for line. I'll tell you what it is. But I wanted to show you like a real log form so you can say, hey, hang on, if I go home and do this, this is literally the thing that I will see. So what we're looking at here is our logs from a tool called Prochnost, or Process Monitor, from the sysinternal suite. Even if you're not doing malware analysis, it's a really cool set of things. Microsoft has owned for a bunch of time. You can download it freely from. But it logs a bunch of things that actually happen on the system, whether it's malware or what. So naturally, the first thing I'll do in dynamic analysis is start my capture and then execute my malware. And that's what we see. We see process start and then thread create. Ignore the process name. The malware has some kind of BS name. After that, we see it continue to go through its execution. And the first thing we see of any kind of interest is a bunch of read file. And the file that it's reading is rsa.enh.dll. Now, I will be entirely honest with you, I had no idea what that was off the bat. But I've learned that it is the Microsoft Enhanced Cryptographic Provider. Now, I also will not lie to you and say, aha, I know exactly what this malware is going to do. It is using our crypto library. But it's useful information, exactly. That doesn't tell you everything at all. It's useful information, especially to go back and look at in retrospect. And then here, this is very small. Again, you don't actually have to read it, but I just wanted to show the logs to show you that this is a thing that you can see. The malware begins to establish persistence. So I'll just call it cryptolocker.exe. That's not really its name, but that's what I'll call it. Begins to read file, write file, read file, write file, read file, write file. And the file that it's reading is itself from where I executed it on the desktop. And the write file is another copy of itself in application data. So we see it moving itself into application data. And then we see it launch itself from application data. So it launches a second process of itself. Okay, a little weird. A lot of times, like in malware, we'll see mutexes in there to make sure it only launches one copy of itself. But here it launched two. Okay. And it became clear very, very quickly. So this is a loop of things that just keep happening. These are reg open key, registry, open key, query key, query value, close key, open key, that over and over again. It's doing something in the registry key. And we see the name. The registry key is HKCU for current user, software, Microsoft, Windows, current version, run, and run once. So you might not know what that does off the bat. You can Google it, because it's clearly important, because it keeps searching for this for some reason. And what you find if you did Google it, is that key makes a certain thing happen on startup. So this is saying, hey, run me on startup, and it just keeps doing it, which is kind of a weird persistence. It just keeps doing it to make sure it stays in that key. So when you reboot, CryptoLocker will come back. Okay, so now we kind of know how it's being persistent. And then this is where, for me, it gets interesting. So we see two log lines here. And what we see are TCP send and TCP receive. So again, the lens at which I'm looking through this malware at is the lens of someone who has a focus on network-based traffic. So for me, this is like, yes, okay, we got something. So what I'm going to do is shift over from here, Prochnost, to Wireshark. So I imagine lots of people are familiar with Wireshark. This is the same thing, just bigger. Wireshark, if you're not familiar, is like a packet capture tool that displays packet captures and parses them. And I had a packet capture utility running, and I viewed the packet capture afterwards in Wireshark. And I saw something that for me was a little bit weird. And it was certainly network traffic. I'm not sure if anyone can make this out, but the important part of it is this column here, the protocol column, and it's tons and tons of DNS. Additionally, the domains that it's querying for change every time, and they look like garbage. I just said they look like garbage, and I was going to go and try to read one out. They look like garbage. I can't really do that. But this, for me, was kind of interesting because, okay, this is not only network traffic, but it's a lot of it is something weird. This might be something I can trigger on. So it keeps doing this for a while, and it keeps finding domains that didn't exist or weren't real, but eventually it finds a real one. And we got some command and control traffic. So at first, I do not know what this traffic is, but I see it grab something down, and then the network connections stop. Okay. So that's something. I'll make a note of that, and I'll take that information and I will go back to my system monitor and see what's happening, Prochnost specifically. So I see a few more interesting log lines. The first thing I see it do is store something it calls a public key in the registry, in a key named software CryptoLocker, and then some numbers. Okay, so it makes a registry key called CryptoLocker, and it stores something called a public key. It could be a red herring, but I don't know. I do now know, but at the time, I don't know. And then we see it go through this loop lots and lots of times on my system. And what it's doing is it is trying to read every file on my desktop, or on my entire computer, not my desktop, excuse me, my desktop computer, to see what types of files they are. And when it stumbles upon a particular type of file that it likes, which is PDF, it starts reading and writing and reading and writing and reading and writing. And when it discovers it, it's writing back out an encrypted copy of that same file. Okay, so it loops through my entire disk and any attached network drives. I'm not going to show you all the logs because that's like lots of lines, but it's more of this, which is the same thing, just bigger. But eventually it finishes the loop and it's checked every file, and it kind of closes its loop to return around. So what it's done here is it writes to a registry key a bunch of times, and what it's writing is file names. It's writing the name of every file that is encrypted to a registry key. Also useful information for me. So this goes on, and it happens in a loop fashion. Once it's done the first loop, it tells, this pops up on your screen, your own sucks. Something I found funny, two things. One, RSA 2048 is a link to Wikipedia. So just kind of rub in like, yeah, I got you, bro. Like, you're screwed. Like, just in case you didn't know what RSA 2048 was, it lets you know. I wonder how many people click that. You shouldn't click that. Like, if you were a user who got owned, you clicked it. And I guess you're already owned. Stop. Lose shit. I don't know. I've never made that connection before, but I clicked it. Also, the thing on the top right for you guys was what your computer background was changed into. Another little anecdote. You know, people sometimes don't lock their monitors, their computers. Yeah, which you should. You should lock your monitor. I thought this would be really funny to drop this people's background when I found their computers unlocked. Because what it says is, the files on this computer and emissions of file types have been encrypted. You've got CryptoLocker. But, and this is the reason I unfortunately had to not do it, if you do not see the CryptoLocker window, it means your AV has deleted CryptoLocker. Unfortunately for you, you cannot recover your files unless CryptoLocker is on your computer. So here's a link. If you do not see CryptoLocker, you should go download it again so you can get your files back. Now, what I will say is, like, they still make you pay, but that was a true thing. But the last thing I wanted was like, I got you, and then you went and like downloaded CryptoLocker to get your files back. But now that CryptoLocker is defunct, like, it should be safe to do that. Probably shouldn't do that though. It's too late. Okay, so we finished a run, so we have to ask ourselves, what do we know? And I'm going to speed up a little bit just for the sake of time now. We have to ask ourselves, what do we know? Know is italicized, it's underlined, and it would have been bolded, but this slide template bolded the rest of the text in the heading anyway. That might be important. But there are some things that we know. A, we know some domain names, and we know some IP addresses. If you're an analyst or a researcher looking to investigate malware infrastructure, that information is very useful to you. It can help you identify whether infections on your network are the same thing, or allow you to investigate the infrastructure. And we also know at least one registry key that it makes to look for on an endpoint. And again, all of this can be useful for a blue team. So that slide was hint, hint, what do we know? The next slide is strong hint, hint, what do we think we know? So there are a couple of things that we think we know. We think we know that it uses advanced public key cryptography. We know that because it uses the Windows implementation of it instead of trying to write its own, we see a public key value in the registry key. Good hints. We also think we know, this maybe should have been on the last slide. But we see it move through tons of DNS requests until it finds a real one. But the very valuable thing is that it didn't begin encrypting files until it found active C2, command and control. Okay, so these are all things that we think we know. And me being someone who's interested in network traffic, I might have a bottleneck. Because what I think I see here is that the malware, it will try to infect your box, but it won't encrypt your files until it has successful network traffic to one of its hosts. So like, I don't know if I'd say alarm bells, but like, this is what I decide to key into, because again, what we're talking about here is investigating malware through the context of what you personally would find useful. And all of this information came in about 15 minutes. I ran the malware for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes, looked at logs for another couple minutes, and I knew all of this. There was no unpacking required. Basically, nothing was required to do this. It might take a little longer if you're not familiar with like registry keys and stuff, but I suggest this is one of those things that just about anybody can do to investigate malware without really having to like dig in and learn a lot about it. So the last two slides, which I suddenly hinted at, were named things that I know and things that I think I know. I had to differentiate because some of the things like the IP addresses that I saw and the domains I saw, I definitely saw. But things that I think I knew, like for example, the fact that it used an actual public key and the fact that it had to talk to the TC2 server, I didn't know for sure because I only observed what happened at that time. And I don't know if there were other code paths, like say on a Monday it encrypted your stuff, on a Tuesday it just RM'd your box. That didn't happen, the odds were low, but I didn't know it didn't happen for sure. So I think that's what like Occam's razor is. It's probably the simple answer, but it's not always, especially in malware where people are intentionally trying to be tricky and deceiving. So doing what I've done just now will get you some basics, but if you'd like to build a more complete picture or a more like accurate truth, is what I guess I'll call it, you want to get a bit deeper. And that's where we'll go into some of the things that I designate as like advanced analysis. This is not everything you can do in the world of malware analysis, but what I'm breaking it down to here is malware disassembly, and then executing malware in a debugger. So for the sake of the presentation, I'm kind of combining the two because they're very similar. Again, one is just doing it while running the code, and one is doing it while not running the code. But that's the next step. So if there was an assembly presentation just before this, and this for me is where it comes into play. So I explained this a bit more in detail for that last session. Here we go. So when people think of reverse engineering malware, typically they think of this. They think of binary analysis. There's a lot other than that, but it's also very useful to do. So when you write a code in a language like C or anything that you compile, you typically end up with a blob like this. And this was the blob, a small part of the blob that made up CryptoLocker, which is the sample we're talking about right now. And this, at least to me, doesn't mean very much. Maybe it does to you, but to me it does not. But with a tool like a disassembler, again, I'm using IDA, it turns into something like this. So this is, there's more code here obviously due to density, but this is contained within this. And it turns into a much more readable format. So again, I'll discuss some IDA alternatives later because IDA can be expensive. Anyway, this is the type of view that we'll have as we proceed to investigate CryptoLocker. The problem here is you might be able to see is that even if you do know assembly, you know it far better than I do, this can still take you some time to sift through and figure out exactly what's going on. And the whole nature of this is looking for the information specifically that I need to save me some time. So this is the same view from earlier where I was looking at the imports of this function. There's one that's highlighted and pointed out by a red arrow, and that one is when HTTP connect. Okay, so for context here, again, I'm interested in network stuff. I saw that it potentially needed to make network traffic before it could infect you. I want to follow that route. When HTTP connect is the way I'm going to do that. So for you, it might be a different function that you want to key in on. Like maybe it's create registry key. I forget the exact name, but whatever it is that you want to look for is the way to go here. So we're going to back in through this. Fortunately for us, when HTTP connect is part of the Windows API. And when you're reversing Windows malware, you see this a lot. And it's awesome for us because it's documented, which is great. Really like the documentation because it exists. So we see this function. What does it say it does? It says it specifies the initial target server of an HTTP request. Okay, so I saw a bunch of weird domain name queries, and now I see the function that takes a domain name in. A good place to follow around backwards. So in short, this says the second argument to this function is the host name that we want to contact. Okay, so let's work backwards here a little bit. So, could have been a little bigger, I apologize for that. But this was the call, when HTTP connect. Again, pointed out by red. So what I'd like to do is follow this backwards to figure out exactly where that domain name is coming from. So if you have some assembly knowledge, or sat in the presentation before, a quick side note, can you make out the instructions at all, visibly? No. Okay. The point that I'd like to make with that is if you were just in the assembly presentation, we see move, push, move, test, jump, push, call, move. For most part, instructions that you now know. So this is real-life malware, the valuable part of it, using plain old instructions that are not hard to understand. So it's a bit of a tie-in to the last presentation. So our disassembler helped us find the location of one HTTP connect, which is this red thing. And we also see where it pushes the argument that is the server name. So that's EVP plus server name. You also have server name. And having an assembly background, I know that EVP plus means it was an argument that was passed in. So what I'm going to do now is step backwards again. Can you read that?
Yes.
Awesome. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to step back again to see where that argument came from. So we're starting here. Connection check is what the function we just stepped backwards out of, and we're going to go upwards. So something I didn't explain is that to pass a value to a function as an argument, you push it before the function call. So the one argument is pushing the register EDI. Okay, so EDI has the argument, which is the host name. So what populated EDI? Okay, EDI, okay, I didn't explain test, but it's one you can look up in the manual, very easy to understand. And then move. We move EAX into EDI. Okay, so whatever was in EAX ended up in EDI, which was what I want. So where did EAX come from? And this is the same function with just a bit more for context. But EAX comes from this, the value of EAX comes from this function that's in blue, or pointed at by blue. And then it loops around a bunch. So what I observed was that it was calling a bunch of different domain names lots of times until it found one that worked. And this appears to be that block of code. Something that comes out of that blue is a domain name. It passes it to the red, it tries it. If it works, we've found our CD2. If not, we haven't. So we're going to step into the blue. And that's here. So the blue is what returns that domain name out of. And we can see how this function works. Hopefully this is somewhat visible. If you were in the assembly part, if not, I'll explain it briefly. So it takes an argument that, by following backwards in the same fashion, discovered was the number of domains we've tried already. And it compares it to 3E8 in hex, which is 1,000 in decimal. So this says, if I haven't tried 1,000, try again. If I have, exit out. So it takes the number, and then it branches down to this side, your right side, if it needs to make another one. So it calls get system time, and then goes into one more function. And I won't show all the assembly because that was a fair bit of assembly, but it worked out to be something like this. We discovered the entire workflow for where all of these domains were coming from. First, it made a key, and it passed that key into that function we were just stepping into to make a domain. It tried it with connection check, which is where we first came backwards from. And if that wasn't valid, if it was valid, it would go ahead and be merry. If it wasn't valid, it would try again up to 1,000 times. So we found this entire functionality, and the cool part was this was something that we could trigger on. It was the network traffic. So by reversing this part of the binary, we were able to reproduce it exactly. And what this allowed us to do was to say, okay, I'll give you the date. You give me all the domains that will be used by any sample of CryptoLocker. So this allowed us to predict any C2, not predict, but know any C2 host before it was ever active. So for me, that was like my game over. That was my solution. And the important part is not to show you that this was doable. And this is my favorite slide out of the entire thing. Ida said that CryptoLocker had approximately 315-ish functions. In order to do what I just produced, and admittedly you had to step through kind of quickly for time, I only had to touch 2% of them. So instead of starting at the entry point and trying to work my way all through the binary to find what I needed by knowing the entire sample, I found what I wanted to know, I worked backwards, and I only had to touch 5 functions, or 2% of the malware to reproduce what was effectively my victory condition. So the point here is that if you know what you want to look for, what's valuable to you, you can find it relatively quickly with a knowledge of assembly. So just to wrap up before whoever's next has to go, is the person who's next here?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry.
He actually found and talked to the creator of CryptoLocker. Is going to talk about it. So.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe we should make this a pattern. That would be cool. So just a couple of tools to talk about before we wrap up the tools that I use here. First and bolded is your favorite search engine. There's a lot of Googling done. I showed you this entire sample in about a half hour. It took me longer to do it than that, of course. So Googling for things is good because not Googling, using your favorite search engine can be very useful. The other tools that I actually use, like visibly here, were Process Monitor from the sysinternal suite, Wireshark to do the packet capture traffic, strings to do the initial string stuff from the ShellShocked malware, and then finally IDA Pro. So IDA is a really cool tool, but it's also relatively expensive, especially if you're doing things not like professionally if you're just doing it like as a hobby. There are some alternatives. IDA has a shareware version, which is a little older and has some functionality removed, but it's still certainly useful on a hobby level. You can use Hopper, which is not free, but you can buy it for like $50, which is a lot better than IDA, or ObsJump, which I think was also affected by the strings bug. But there are alternatives into that for those tools. And again, this is literally everything that I used in the context of preparing this presentation. There are more tools out there, but again, just knowing a couple will get you a long way. So do you want to learn more? So if you would like to learn more, I recommend 3 things. One is opensecuritytraining.info. Again, I mentioned it during the last talk. I think it's super valuable. They have malware analysis courses, assembly courses, easy to consume, freely available, do it whenever you want to. Awesome. Practical malware analysis. A very good book. It comes with lots of labs and custom-written malware for you to try to analyze, and covers things very in-depth. Very, very good book, highly recommended. And then the IDA Pro book. It's not explicit, I mean, it's pretty explicitly about IDA, but there's also a lot of just like, not IDA-specific reverse engineering stuff in there. So another book that I recommend. So just for the sake of time, that is it. Thank you. Again, this slide and the assembly ones will be online if anybody would like them.
We have a second for questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Are you familiar with, and do you have any insight into Crypto Wall 2.0 that just came out a couple of weeks ago?
I have some familiarity with it. I don't have a lot of insight into it.
Do you know if there's any vulnerabilities to decrypting?
No, from my understanding of Crypto Wall is that decryption is sound. Someone posted a blog post a couple of months back when Crypto Wall 1 happened, and I don't know if it changed it, but I think what they were saying was it doesn't overwrite the same location, the file in the same location. So if your disk isn't that busy,
Crypto Wall 2.0 does do secure deletion.
It does. Okay, so then I know nothing about ways to decrypt files with Crypto Wall 2. Sorry?
I said backups.
Yeah.
My office got hit that by Crypto Wall, and that's the only thing.
So as a side note, backups are of course a great strategy, as well as like good permissions, because CryptoLocker would own your entire network share if people were mounted and had permission. But as an interesting note, when CryptoLocker got taken down due to Operation Jawar, somehow, I think it was FireEye and Fox IT, I could be wrong, accessed the key database. I think, somehow they obtained it. And they were providing the keys to people who got owned previously. So people who kept their backups, I know a couple people who this happened to, were able to get their keys back to decrypt all the things they thought were lost permanently, which is kind of cool. So, any other questions?